Hi, my name is Cameron Cooper, and I'm going to be talking about the basic concepts of strength and speed. This is chapter 1 out of the motor learning textbook called Strength Training and Coordination, an Integrative Approach, written by Franz Bosch. We'll start out with what is training theory? Well, to start out, theory is a system of ideas that is intended to explain something. There is no concrete scientific evidence to them. They are more a group of ideas that people have seen tend to happen multiple times, and so they come up with a theory that that is what would actually happen. If it was actually proven scientific fact, it would be called a law. In training, there's a lot of theories simply because there's so many factors that can go into training and so many things that can affect it. We'll talk about this in a little bit. It also does not help though with as far as trying to get an actual law or a way to figure out training when there's just so many variables that can go into it, varying just from each human to each human. And then on top of that, there's not a lot of money being invested in it. So there's the more money that goes into something, you would think that that would help lead to more of a solution. Well, the training world is not getting that luxury. So there's not a lot to invest in. So there is a lot of trial and error in this field. But to start, we'll talk about a reductionist approach. There is reductionist approach and anti-reductionist approach. A reductionist approach uses very simple systems. They don't get too complex. It's very more of cut and dry, simple-minded, kind of the old school way of thinking. The modern day, like anti-reductionists, they use complex systems. So they take into account biological systems. Biological systems take many things into account. This could take whether they're male, female, what they weigh, what have they ate recently, what are they going to eat, how much sleep did they get. You could even include the weather in this. Anything that could possibly affect someone's performance into the weight room. We can translate this to when talking about adaptation. A reductionist thinks of training as a linear. They think if we do this, it should progress in this line. They think that like, oh, this person's getting better. It should be a straight diagonal line upwards, simulating a good gains to whatever they're trying to achieve. Well, training is nonlinear. This is like the anti-reductionist approach. You're gonna have days where you do things and you get better, and you're gonna see lots of progress. Then there's gonna be days where you feel like you're regressing, and you're like, well, are things not working? What's going on? And then over the long run, it might fix itself to where you're doing good. A lot of times you'll see this when people are doing velocity-based throwing programs in baseball. They'll have days where they come in, they're throwing harder, and then they start throwing slower times. They're like, well, what's going on? When really it could just be fatigue or whatever setting into them. And yeah, you have to look at it from the long run to see how they are getting better, but it's not in a straight linear manner. It's non-linear. When training, people have to go through a lot of they have to have flexibility rather, which is like the book Bosch refers to this as noise. They need to have outside factors going in because when you're training to do something, it's just not going to be a perfect scenario every time. Like I'm a baseball player, so I keep using baseball examples. But like when you're pitching, every mound is not going to be the exact same. So your body has to be able to adjust, and this comes to your central nervous system. So like when you're doing stuff that's like training, it's not going to be exactly how you train it. There's going to be some variation, and this is up to your central nervous system to correct that. If it didn't do this and you had to train for every little scenario, we would not get to do a lot, make a lot of progress because we'd have to train every little section rather than just going at one certain exercise or drill and then having. Next, we'll move into training correlation. Bosch talks about different types of throwers. Now, you could take throwers who are elite in multiple different sports that throwing has evolved, such as baseball and shot put. You could take a great shot putter who could be great in that sport, but if you put them in baseball, they are not necessarily going to translate into being a good thrower in a baseball game. This would work the same way as if you put a baseball player in the shot put. There are two different throwing motions that do not necessarily correlate, and that was the whole point of his message, is that you could take stuff that is similar, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to transition. It's important to see what transitions when working out. You don't want to pick workouts and say, oh, these are sport-specific workouts, or oh, I'm trying to get better at this sport, but then it doesn't actually transition into helping you in that sport. You'll see a lot of people, they'll go into the weight room and get stronger, but they might actually get worse at their sport, or it might not actually transition. The book talks about someone working out and learning Taekwondo. Well, if they're doing all these moves and they're learning to do these individual moves of Taekwondo in the dojo, but then they go out into the world and actually have to use it and they can't translate because the settings have changed or because they don't know how to actually link it together in the real thing, then that'd be a problem and show that no transition occurred in the type of training they were doing there. Um, the book also talks about the adjustments your ankle makes. Your ankle is huge. It has a lot more benefit than what you would actually think. It is huge in your postural sway. It's what keeps you actually balanced. If your ankles didn't have the sensories coming into them from the central nervous system, then you'd be more likely to fall or become imbalanced whenever we were walking, especially if you got on a flat surface. Bosch was talking about if we did not have our body naturally making these adjustments, then if you were to start running through like a forest or somewhere with an uneven ground surface, then you would automatically just fall over because you're only used to walking on flat ground. Basic motor properties. This can be broken down simply into independent study and automatic transfer. An independent study is mainly going to be talking about like what actual criteria you want to satisfy when you're working out. It's more talking about like what do you actually want to get better at, so that way that you can hopefully achieve that goal. Automatic transfer is basically a motor property is trained using a given exercise type. Another type of exercise in which the same property also plays a role will automatically change and improve. Hence why it kind of goes with the name automatic transfer. Next, we move into coordination. We'll be talking about speed, strength, and then the reductionist views. Speed and strength both fall under the category of coordination. But to start, we'll talk about the reductionist views. A reductionist thinks to simply get faster at speed, you just need to try and run faster or do drills that might allow you to run faster. A reductionist might think that you'll get faster simply by putting a parachute on your back and running, and then taking the parachute off, and then they think that you'd naturally run faster from that. A reductionist would think in the weight room, if you want to get stronger, it's simply about just pushing up more weight and then getting your muscles bigger. But as you know, Bosch likes to take the anti-reductionist view to pretty much everything. He says that speed is not necessarily how fast can you get one body part moving, so that way you gain a certain distance in a certain amount of time. He thinks that speed is how well can you time up the movements, how well can you time up the mechanics so that you work in the most fluid motion possible to get going. He also thinks that in strength, he thinks that strength is more, he's all into it actually affecting your sport and actually doing stuff that transitions like we previously talked about it. How does coordination play into this? Well, he's, as we talked about, in speed, you want to time up the exact things at the right time so that way that you can have the most fluid motion. This would take a certain level of coordination, but he also talks about how to be fast and to be coordinated. It takes a certain level of strength to achieve that. So that is how you'd be able to tie in all three of these things together. Bosch then moves into talking about sensory motor function. In this area, he was really more talking about the decision making and the judgments for when trying to design a workout. He talks about how, like as we've been saying throughout this whole thing, picking workouts that are necessarily going to work with what you're trying to achieve, but making stuff that actually is going to translate. This is where the sensory motor gets involved and the judgments have to be used. For example, he's talking about how it's very famous for an injured sprinter or just runner in general to want to run in the pool afterwards as a form of recovery, and that's actually a practice that's widely used in like the PT fields. But what he's studied and what he's found shows that it will not actually help that person out because when they go back to their sport, their body is going to recognize the difference between running in the water and then running in like on the concrete or the grass or whatever. the body is going to sense the different areas and will completely almost ignore the fact of the training that you did in the water. This could also be translated to baseball when you hear about people talking about trying to swing a bat in the water. Like it makes sense that you would think, like a reductionist would think that that would work because it makes it harder to swing the bat and you're having to really push through all that water, which is tough. But the body knows when it gets out into the real world that it's in a much different setting from that, and it will not actually allow that to translate. Whole practice versus part practice. Part practice, as you can see in the picture over here, is breaking down the individual parts of the sport into individual segments, whereas whole practice is combining the things into a more of a group. So like with the basketball example over here, there's many parts of it in basketball. There's catching, there's shooting, dribbling, driving, and then there's the whole practice, which is actually putting all things together. We're looking at this from a strength training standpoint, whereas you may do a certain thing to train like part practice by like training a certain aspect of the game, such as particularly shooting. Or like you could designate a certain workout to increase a certain muscle to specifically help you with a certain action in your sport. But then there's strength training that's really trying to get at whole practice, which is incorporating the entire movement of what you're going to be doing in the sport into a workout, so that way it all completely applies rather than breaking up individually and hoping that they connect with each other to properly help you. Then we move into the reductionist view of strength training. The main views of this are bodybuilding, powerlifting, weightlifting, and then we have the influences of physical therapy. In the bodybuilding section, it's pretty much all about hypertrophy. It's pretty much seeing just how much bigger can we get, how big can we make our muscles, whereas the powerlifting is more about really trying to get and be explosive. And then the weightlifting it talks about is a lot of narrowing down to specific body muscles, what we want to work out, and the very stereotypical approach you see when people go to the gym. And then we have the physical therapy influences, which are mainly meant to like focus on strengthening and playing with the tissues that are in your body, as well as really working on being more stable around the joint areas. An anti-reductionist view would be combining more of these so that it adjusts to your sport, and then not just going in there and trying to get bigger, because we talked about earlier that may not necessarily work. Then we move in from talking about the physical therapy side that we just mentioned to continuing it with talking about dynamic systems and stability training. In physical therapy, it's really talking about working with different ranges of motions, and it's talking about like doing different exercises at a certain range of motion, rather like maybe you're right out of surgery and it's talking about doing it at a short range of motion versus doing that workout with a wide range of motion. And does it really help us to be doing it at the shorter range of motion? This also piggybacks with the idea of doing these workouts at low versus high intensity. If you do them at a low intensity, is it really necessarily going to translate to when you're actually doing the games to be high intensity? And Bosch seems to think that it doesn't necessarily is going to translate, which I tend to kind of disagree with him in this aspect, because I think that you can't necessarily just gear somebody in right after an injury and hope that, we got to get them used to their game speed. Well, I think that's how you possibly lead to re-injury. I could be wrong, but that's just my general perspective on this. And that's kind of the same with the ranges of motions. I think you need to kind of gradually work into getting it back to full motion, and that I think it's better to be doing some work at that. I also do not agree with Bosch when he is talking about injury rehabilitation. He has a certain chart that he goes by that shows how quickly they should be getting into full game speed activity. In his chart, he's talking about a grade 2 calf injury, which is a pretty severe tear, and he's talking about 3 days after injuring him, having them go back into training. I personally, at least from what I've learned about rehab, personally do not agree with this. I feel that is really rushing someone into getting back, and it's just bound to get somebody rehurt. I get that he wants to train people at an actual speed of what they're going to be involved in, but I feel that is more just likely to lead to injury rather than doing them good. I will move on to talking about the strength and coordination section, as well as the strength training and transfer section in my next video.